I was 5 years old when I first discovered that God is real. I'll never forget it. I was sitting in the family room of my parents' home. My favorite aunt and uncle were visiting from out of state. I remember the grown-ups, my mom, dad, by the way, that's my parents. So let's just take a moment and celebrate my mother's dress. I mean, that is quite a dress, right? And actually, the sofa that my parents sat on looked quite a bit like that dress. 1970s, that's me holding my dad's hand, my little brother. And my favorite aunt and uncle were visiting from out of town, and they were all the grown-ups were sitting on the sofas. By the way, this was back in the 1970s when we kept the plastic on the sofas after we bought them. Do you guys remember that? Anybody kept the plastic on their sofa? I still don't understand why that happened, but my mom was convinced we needed to keep it clean. So I remember sitting on the shag carpet with my brother, listening to the grown-ups talk, and I was so happy just to be able to be in the same room as these people that I love so very much. And that's when my dad said the words that no child wants to hear. Michele, it's time for bed. How dare he tell me to go to bed when I was having such a great time? Well, I was so mad that he was forcing me to go to bed when I wanted to hang out with the grown-ups that I decided to throw a fit and teach him a lesson. So I, folded my arms and I huffed and puffed and stomped all the way to my bedroom because I was going to teach him who was in charge. Well, after I got to my room, I realized my mistake. You see, by the time I woke up the next morning, my aunt and uncle would be gone. It was the last night that they were with us. And because I was so angry and decided to stomp to my room, I didn't tell them goodbye. And I knew once I got sent to bed, there was no getting out of bed and going back out there. And so the reality of missing that opportunity to say goodbye to them was crushing to my 5-year-old heart. And so I laid in bed and decided to pray. You see, my parents became Christians when I was only an infant. And I had learned in church that there is a God and he is real and that he hears our prayers. So I thought I would give it a test and see what would happen. And so I laid in bed like only a 5-year-old can. And through my tears, I prayed, God, please, 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 God, please, help my aunt and uncle to come to my room so I can tell them I'm sorry and goodbye. And just a few moments later, the door to my bedroom opened and light came in from the hallway and my uncle stood right there. And I don't remember what I said, what he said, but I do remember that he came to my bed. I was able to give him a hug and tell him goodbye. Now, something happened that night that changed my life. And very simply, I discovered that God was real. And not only was he real, he cared enough to listen to the very silly prayer of a 5-year-old girl who hadn't behaved very well. Well, from that moment forward, I was different. By the time I was 7 years old, I walked down an aisle in my home church, not all that different from that one, and went to the front of the church where I told everybody in the room that I believed Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God, and I wanted him to be my Lord and Savior, and I was baptized. By the time I was 15 years old, by the way, that's me around that age. I mean, look at those legs. And that big book under my arm is my Bible. And we were at a camp, a Christian camp. By the time I was 15, I walked down another aisle at a youth conference where I decided to dedicate my life to full-time Christian service. I didn't know what that meant, but I hoped it would have something to do with serving God around the world. I wanted to give my life to him and serve him full-time. By the time I was 16, I went on my first mission trip to the Dominican Republic and Haiti, where I helped to build a church and do vacation Bible school. And Another life-changing experience after that. By the time I was 18, I went to a Christian college where my goal was to get a missions degree. After a couple years there, I went on to get my bachelor's of science in nursing. I became a nurse because I was going to use my nursing degree on the mission field. And then by the time I was 21 years old, I met a man who was also at Christian college, who was going to be a pastor. We got married and started full-time ministry as pastors of a church in the United States. So it looked like the prayers of that 5-year-old girl and then the growing prayers as I grew up and my heart was to love Jesus and serve him. All of those prayers were being answered in beautiful fashion, right? My life was going according to plan. And I was going to do good things for God. And then a few years later, 6 days before Christmas, I watched my husband drive away for the last time as I held our 1.5-year-old, and I became, like that, a single divorced mom of a 1.5-year-old and a former pastor's wife. Now, what do you do when your whole life has been about planning this future and then the future goes up in smoke, just like that? And the other thing that was so difficult for me is for years I had prayed for my marriage and my husband. In fact, I started praying that God would bring me a godly man when I was in grade school, when I was like 10, 11, 12 years old, praying that God would allow me to partner in ministry with someone and be married to them. I had prayed and prayed and prayed, God, please, God, please, God, please. So where did the God of the 5-year-old girl go? Where did the God who answered her silly prayer go? Because this was a much more important prayer. And rather than saving my marriage and my family and my ministry, it was gone. What followed over the next couple of years was a season of significant wrestling with my faith. You know, I had a theology that believed that if you do everything right, if you make all the right decisions and make good choices, that faith was like a math equation. 2 + 2 = 4, right? And if you do everything right, then you need to get a good result. Well, I had done my part. Why wasn't God doing his part? And I didn't know what to do with that. For a long time, and this is me being very vulnerable, I didn't even know if I wanted to have that kind of God in my life. Finally, after a lot of wrestling, I came to discover an important truth. Life without God is also full of pain, but there's no hope. And so one very difficult night in my bedroom, I remember praying. I finally reached the end, and I cried out, and I said, God, I need you more than I need to understand. Well, that was a turning point when I started to realize that faith isn't always a math equation that adds up. And that was a difficult season, and I thought that that would be the end of it, but I later discovered that that was only the warm-up. Not long after, I met a man at our church. He had been unexpectedly divorced as well. He had 2 young sons. We met at church and began dating, and we decided, well, wouldn't it be just easier to get married and bring our 2 families together? It couldn't be that hard, right? And that began our journey of step family and blended family. And for anybody who has ever gone through challenges in family or families that have broken up and blended family, all of that, it is complicated. You can't put a bunch of people who have been wounded by the brokenness of family all together in a house and expect them all to get along all the time. Well, that was another difficult season. Took about 10 years for us to kind of process through and work through. And by the way, during that season, we raised 3 boys who became 3 teenagers. Anybody who has ever raised teenage boys know that it's kind of next level. Like, let's just tell you right now, the volume in my house is higher, right? Those of you who have boys understand exactly what I'm saying. Well, about the time we thought we got over the hump of that, and I thought, okay, we're making progress, we're going to be okay, I got a phone call. Now, my boys, it was the Tuesday before the American holiday of Thanksgiving. I had just sent my boys out the door to go to another day of school. My husband was getting ready to go to work, and my phone rang. And I picked up the phone, and on the other end of the line was my doctor. The week before, I had gone to see him because I had a tiny little sore on the side of my tongue that just wouldn't heal. It happens sometimes, no big deal. So I went to the doctor, and he said I had nothing to worry about, but he decided to do a biopsy of that tiny little sore on my tongue, just to be sure. But he told me, he said, Michele, you have nothing to worry about. It's fine. So I didn't worry until that Tuesday when he called me and he simply said, I'm sorry, Michele, it's not good. And that day I found out that I had squamous cell carcinoma of the tongue, or cancer of the tongue. Okay? I didn't even know that existed. That type of cancer is typically the type of cancer that 70 or 80-year-old men get who have smoked and drank their whole life. I don't know if you know this, but I'm none of those things. I was a very healthy woman. I exercised regularly. I ate very healthy. I was just very, very committed to my physical health. So it made no sense. In fact, the doctors couldn't explain it. So what followed over the next days and weeks included multiple doctor's appointments, PET scans where they scanned my body to see if the cancer had spread. And after a couple of weeks, which were very tortuous, I discovered that it was actually a best-case scenario. They had caught the cancer early. They needed to do a very small procedure to remove a section of my tongue, but my doctor said, we got it all. You have nothing to worry about. And so I put cancer in a box, and I set it on a shelf and never expected to see it again. Except they were wrong. 2.5 years later, I got another call. This would have been 2014. And my doctor called me again. I'm sorry, Michele. I don't know what to say, but the cancer has come back. This time it was more advanced than the first time. They did a 4-hour surgery where they removed 1/3 of my tongue, which, by the way, is not very comfortable. I was rather attached. They did something called a biological skin graft, okay? And without going into detail, I'm a former nurse, so I kind of find it fascinating. But the biological skin graft, they take a sterilized section of a pig bladder and they stitched it onto the side of my mouth in the hopes of having a functional tongue again. Now, I know you're kind of appalled right now because I just said a sterilized section of a pig bladder. Basically, for the last 10 years, I've had a slab of bacon in my mouth, which is a pretty sweet deal, okay? In all seriousness, it's fascinating what the body can do. It took about 8 weeks for me to recover from that. After that 8 weeks, I was so determined and committed to overcoming. I'm kind of tenacious, and I'm a pretty determined, and my husband would call me stubborn, but I call it determined. After 8 weeks of recovery of that, I ran a half marathon, if you can believe that. That's a lot. That's like, what, 13.1? That's a long distance, let's just say, okay? And I did a half marathon and was just so determined to live. And then shortly after that half marathon, I jumped on a plane and went to my first speaking event after having 1/3 of my tongue removed. Once again, the doctor said, Michele, we got it all. You have nothing to worry about. And so we put cancer in a box and we set it on a shelf, and I never expected to see it again. Except they were wrong. About 8 months later, November of 2014, I got another call. The doctor just didn't even know what to say. They basically gave me about 2 weeks to get my affairs in order. At which point in time, again, the week of the American holiday of Thanksgiving, they put me in the hospital where they did a 9-hour surgery to remove 2/3 of my tongue. When you remove that much of your tongue, they have to rebuild it so you can swallow. And so they cut me open from wrist to elbow and took out blood vessels and tissue. They also cut open my neck about 6 to 8 inches, took out at least a dozen lymph nodes of my submandibular gland. The cancer had spread to my lymph nodes. They took all these different pieces and parts to try to rebuild me because you cannot swallow or function or whatever without it working. And then they took another skin graft from my leg to kind of rebuild all the parts. And so this picture right here is me in the hospital. What I hadn't mentioned to you earlier as part of my story is in between my first and second diagnosis, we had foster adopted those young 3 children. We had added 3 children to our family. They had a history of severe abuse and neglect, and we got a phone call one day that said, "Will you take them?" And so we started parenting all over again. So here we are. I'm in the hospital, having had this major surgery. I was in the ICU for 2 days, the hospital for a week. And on top of that, there was a real concern at this point if I would survive. And so we have these 3 young kids who have this horrible, traumatic, abusive history, who already lost one set of parents. And now they're looking at their adoptive mom in the hospital, wondering if they're going to lose her. After the doctors gave me about 4 weeks to recover from that surgery, they started external radiation and chemotherapy. Now, without going into detail on that, when you start shooting radiation at this part of the body, the consequences are severe. After about 6 weeks of daily radiation and chemotherapy, I had burns from here to here on the outside and the inside of my body. My vocal cords were so burned that they couldn't rub together to make a sound, so I could not speak at all. I had scars everywhere. I had a feeding tube for 6 months where I got all of my water and nutrition through that feeding tube. I had a tracheostomy to keep me from choking and allow me to still be able to breathe. And I was on 24-hour-a-day fentanyl. Have you heard of fentanyl? It's like 30 times more potent than heroin, pretty significant pain reliever, and liquid morphine. And the reason I was on those pain medications is because my pain levels were so severe that without them I would have gone into shock. And that was for 6 months. We're not talking a bad day. We're talking about 6 months. By the time all was said and done, the doctors actually told me, "Michele, we had to take you to the brink of death in hopes of maybe saving your life." And so by the time all was said and done, I had lost about 50, 60 pounds. I was very, very, very tiny. I had scars and burns all over my body. And there was really not any part of my body that was unaffected by cancer, except for my right leg. And I told my husband, there's nothing more sexy than a right leg. You just knock yourself out, babe. In all seriousness, I was wrecked. I was completely and utterly wrecked. You know, that girl who had been so determined, so stubborn, so strong, I had no fight left in me. None. I was alive, but I would never be the same again. Do you want to know how many times I prayed, "Please, God, please, God, please, please, God, please"? Where did he go? Where was the God that the 5-year-old girl had prayed to? I had been doing good things for him. I had been using my voice for years. I had done ministry as a speaker, talking about the gospel. And yet I had lost it all. Why? That's my story. What's yours? If you think I'm only here to tell you a sad cancer story, you have missed the point. You see, every single one of us in this room have our own version of cancer. Everyone in this room has been marked and scarred by something that has almost taken them under. You know what it is. Your story may look different than mine, but it is no less painful and no less devastating. Some of you right now are going, well, mine's not nearly as bad as yours. Nope, pain is pain. Pain is pain. Suffering is suffering. And I really want you not to focus so much on me and my story, but I want you to think about your own. Because I'm guessing, like me, you have had your moment of wondering, where did God go? Why won't he do something? Please, God, please, God, please. Right now, even without knowing the details of your story, I would say we are living in difficult times. Anybody agree with me? Yep. I looked up, the United Nations keeps a list of the top 10 issues internationally. And January 2024, so just a few months ago, this is what the list of the top issues around the world are right now. Climate change, wars, military conflicts, water contamination, human rights violations, global health issues, poverty, children's poor access to healthcare, education, and safety. By the way, who would have thought that just a lack of safety would be a top issue in our world? And access to food and pervasive hunger. Those are just the big things. And then on top of that, we have all of our daily challenges, right? The stories and the losses and the sufferings that some people never hear about that you are dealing with on a daily basis. So what do we do with that? In many ways, we are in the middle of a perfect storm. And it's threatening to dismantle our faith in a very real God. There's a story in Luke 8:22 where Jesus and the disciples are on a boat. I'm just going to read it to you because it sounds like a good metaphor for our reality. One day Jesus said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side of the lake. So they got in a boat and set out. As they sailed, Jesus fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped. By the way, it's a squall. It's not just a light rain. It is a full-out, terrifying storm. The boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a life-threatening situation. The disciples, panicked, I'm sure, went and woke Jesus, saying, Master, Master, we're going to drown. In Matthew's version of this, the Gospel of Matthew, it says that they cried out to Jesus, Master, Master, don't you care if we drown? Oh, I've prayed that prayer before. Anybody else? Jesus got up, rebuked the wind and the raging waters, and the storm subsided, and all was calm. And then Jesus looked at his disciples and asked a very important question. He looked at them and said, where is your faith? In the middle of the worst storm that they had faced, when they thought they were going to drown, Jesus didn't talk about the weather. He looked at them and said, Where is your faith? This is the question that I think we must all wrestle with when we deal with life's unexpected circumstances. Where is our faith? You see, there are some whose life circumstances causes them to abandon their faith, and there are some whose life circumstances causes them to deepen their faith. And how do you and I become one and not the other? How do we become the kind of men and women whose faith actually gets stronger in storms, not weaker? Well, we're going to spend some time for the remaining time talking about a guy in the Bible named Simon Peter, because I think he experienced storms like we did. And as a result of his storms, at the end of his life, he became a man of unshakable faith. But some things happened to get him there. Now, Peter was a guy like us. He was ordinary. In Luke 5, we see that he was a fisherman. That was what he did by trade. Jesus went and found him at his workplace and invited him to follow him. And Peter had a choice, to follow Jesus or to stay with the status quo. And Peter made a courageous choice. He left everything behind and followed Jesus. For 3 years, he was part of Jesus' inner circle. He saw Jesus perform amazing miracles, including the storm being calmed that day on the lake. And then throughout this process, Peter kind of rose from the pack as the leader among the disciples. In fact, at one point, Jesus looked at Peter, and his name was Simon. He renamed him Peter, which means rock, and says, "On this rock I will build my church." So there was something in Peter that had the makings of leadership, right? And Jesus called it out. And yet, when we get to the end of Jesus' ministry, when Jesus is arrested and then prosecuted and convicted, we see that Peter denies Jesus 3 times. That's in Luke 22. So how do we go from Peter, a fisherman who leaves everything to follow Jesus, who follows Jesus for 3 years, and through that process becomes a leader? In fact, so much so that Jesus said, "On this rock I'm going to build my church." We see this progression. And then all of a sudden, when Jesus is arrested, Peter denies even knowing him. Whew. You know why I like that story? Because it sounds familiar. You see, part of Peter's, I believe, denying of Jesus is he didn't know what to do when Jesus didn't behave the way he thought he should. You see, Peter was expecting a reigning king, a God who came and was powerful and strong and conquered all of the Roman peoples and cured every injustice and healed every bad thing and became this powerful, reigning king on earth. He did not expect a Messiah who would die. And what happens when God doesn't behave the way that we think he should? We start to question if maybe what we believe isn't true, right? But before Peter denied Jesus, something happened the night before that was really pivotal in Peter's journey. And I want you to read it with me. This is in Luke 22. It's the Last Supper. Jesus is dining with his disciples, the Last Supper. Jesus knows that he is going to his death. He knows what's going to happen. Peter doesn't. The disciples still don't understand that Jesus was going to die for us. Jesus does know. And at this Last Supper, he looks at Peter And there's 4 verses here that we're going to read. He looks at Peter during the middle of his meal, and he says this, Simon, Simon, Peter, Peter, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith would not fail. And when you've turned back, strengthen your brothers. Hidden within these few verses, I believe Jesus was giving Peter 3 anchors to his faith that would help him endure even when his world fell apart. 3 anchors. Like I said, Peter doesn't know what's coming, but Jesus does. So I want you to picture this. The first anchor that Jesus gave Peter in that important moment at the Last Supper was this, a warning. Simon, Simon, Peter, Peter, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. Very simply, Jesus is letting Peter know, buddy, the devil is going to eat you for lunch. Are you ready? Peter, Satan is going to come after you. It's coming, Peter. It's coming. Don't be surprised. Sometimes I think you and I have bought into this belief that if we work hard enough or pray hard enough or do all the right things, that we are entitled to a pain-free life. That is a lie. Jesus said very clearly, in this world you will have trouble. Okay? There is no exceptions to that. If you are on this side of heaven, and we are in human bodies here, we will have trouble. That means we will have sickness. We will have parts of our bodies that hurt. And by the way, I'm getting older, and it hurts more and more every time I stand up. Our eyes won't always work. Our relationships won't always be easy. In fact, quite the opposite. The unexpected is unavoidable on this side of heaven. Suffering and pain is part of this human experience. And I know that sounds like really bad news, but Jesus wanted to give Peter a warning so he wouldn't be surprised. And I think he wants to give that to us too. My friends, if you have a day without any kind of pain, it's nothing but a gift. The human experience is hard. It is. And we are not entitled to anything else. Very simply, Jesus wanted Peter to know that you and I have an enemy. And his aim is to destroy your faith. You see, pain and suffering are a guarantee on this side of heaven. But make no mistake, what is at stake in these places of pain isn't what you think it is. You see, when I was diagnosed with cancer over and over and over again, when I was fighting for my life, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was that I would die. No. The worst thing that could happen to me is not the loss of my life, it's the loss of my faith. What was most at stake when I was fighting for my life is that somehow I would stop believing in a God who loved me. That I would be confused by the presence of my pain, and I would become convinced that the presence of my pain meant the absence of God, and that's not true. What is most at stake for you and I in our places of suffering and loss isn't the outcome of that particular situation, but the existence of our faith. We have an enemy, and his aim is to destroy our faith. But Jesus didn't stop there. He gave Peter a second anchor. He gave him a promise. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. Hold on a second. Did you just read that? But I have prayed for you. Did you hear that? God with us, the Emmanuel, Jesus, God in flesh, prays for your faith. Long before Peter failed, Jesus prayed. Do you understand that? That the God of heaven knows what is coming before you do, and he's already prayed over it for you. You and I have no control over what will happen today, tomorrow, the next day. I have no idea if cancer will come back I have no idea. I live every day knowing that cancer can come back at any moment. But guess what? Jesus has already prayed for it. He's already prayed for my faith. Yes, you and I, we have an enemy, and his aim is to destroy our faith, but we also have a Savior. And his plan for our redemption and rescue is already in place. Already. J.I. Packer said it this way: your faith will not fail while God sustains it. You are not strong enough to fall away while God is resolved to hold you. I did an interview with a woman one time that heard my story, and she was asking me questions. And so she said in response to my story, so basically you crawled back to faith. And I said, nope, I couldn't do even that. I did not crawl back to faith. I did not even have the strength to crawl back to my faith in Jesus. He came and got me. Hebrews says that Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith. I can take no credit for the fact that I stand here today still believing in the goodness of God. I'm standing here today still believing in the goodness of God because God won't let me go. It is his work. And if he can do it for me, he does it for you. A warning, a promise. But he didn't end there. He also gave Peter a mission. He said at the end of that, I have prayed for you that your faith will not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. When, not if. Jesus was confident. Peter would turn back. He would make mistakes. He would fail. But he would turn back. And he said, when you do, strengthen your brothers. In other words, our rescue, the redemption that God has worked in us, the second chance at life that he's given us is not just for us. It's for everybody in this room. You and I, if we have, through some miracle of God's grace, come to know him and been rescued and redeemed by him and been put back together again by him, we have been given that gift so we can go and tell anybody else who needs a rescue that he's got redemption for them too. We can't keep it to ourselves, my friends. We can't. The only reason I am here is for this reason. I mean, remember, my vocal cords were so burned I couldn't make a sound. And here I am talking. I do not believe that he put me back together again so I could just have a nice, cushy life. He put me back together again so I could let everybody that I meet know that there is a God who loves them too. There is no one beyond the reach of his hand and his grace. There is nothing, there's somebody in here that needs to know this. There is nothing that you have done that puts you outside the reach of his ability to redeem. There's not a one of you. Oh, goodness, I wish you knew how much he loved you. How much he loved you. A warning, a promise, a mission. Y'all, we need each other. We cannot do this life on our own. We have to stay together. And I urge you, stay connected here. Even if your life is relatively easy right now, it won't be, I promise you. Hard things will come, and you're going to need this family. Within the community of God, we are a family. And we help each other. And we strengthen each other's faith, right? Right? And if I can stand here and testify to that, you can too. So you let God do that work in your heart, but then you refuse to be silent about the goodness of God. And you keep testifying that even in places of suffering, he can redeem. Philip Yancey said it this way: true healing of deep connective tissue takes place in community. Where is God when it hurts? Where God's people are. You feel overwhelmed and alone, you wonder where God is, then you come right back here and we'll help you find him. He's with you. It's been 9 years since that third diagnosis. I am, at the moment, cancer-free, and it's a gift, and I'm grateful, but I no longer think it's the point. This is my family, by the way. I have a lot of children. So thank you for giving me a vacation from them for a short time. It's very tempting to look at this picture and just see perfection. Let me tell you, there is a lot of pain and suffering in that picture. We have 3 kids that went through severe abuse, neglect, that live with all kinds of serious trauma. We are in counseling all the time. We do lots of therapy. I live with pain in my body every single day. It is not easy to live with a broken body. There is a lot of suffering here. It's important for you to know this because there is no nice, neat bow on my story. Every day is hard. And there are things that I'm not even at liberty to share with you in a public forum because it's a private pain. But just know there is suffering every day in that family right there. And we are fighting for our faith all the time. I have to wake up every day and decide, am I going to be marked by my pain or am I going to be marked by the faithfulness of God? Am I going to be the woman who talks funny or am I going to be the woman who has something to say? How about you? Are you going to be the woman, the man, who all you see is your pain and suffering? Are you going to see the Jesus in the boat that knows how to calm the storm and strengthen your faith? At the end of his life, Peter wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Peter. He had indeed done what Jesus predicted and led the New Testament church. But it wasn't easy. It was a time of severe persecution and suffering. In fact, Peter, it is believed that he was martyred between AD 60 and AD 64. And right before he lost his life, he wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Peter. In 1st Peter, suffering is mentioned in every chapter of that letter. Every one. The people of the Church of God were going through intense suffering within the Roman Empire. It was not a good time. But Peter understood something about that. He knew something about a God that didn't always behave the way he thought he should. And so I'm going to read some of Peter's last words. And I want you to see if you can hear within his words the 3 anchors that Jesus gave him: a warning, a promise, and a mission. And then here Peter is at his end of his life, and he's turning around and giving us those same 3 anchors. You ready? 1 Peter 5. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Be alert and of sober mind, because your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, knowing that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of suffering. And the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. Father God, what a tremendous grace that you have came and found us and held us firm And then when we've had every reason to walk away from our faith, God, you would not let us go. God, I pray that you would open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to know you more, that you would help to, in spite of the many different storms and circumstances we experience, that you would strengthen our faith, that you would get us so grounded in your presence and your goodness and your reality, that even though we may grieve and weep, we also believe with hope. Strengthen our faith, God, and help us to live on mission, telling everyone about the redemption that you have for them too. In the name of Jesus, amen.